Well, guys, it's that time of the year again where I very wrongly predict what's going to happen in our fantasy league. However, this time we're at Volume 3 as the third season of Dynasty approaches. I've been so busy this year that I unfortunately wasn't able to do an end of season video and analysis on year 2, but I'll briefly cover it in my rankings and award predictions for this season. So without further ado, let's get started with number 10. And coming in at number 10, finishing in the now ultra dreaded last place spot since our league elected to incorporate a last place punishment, is going to be none other than the team from LA. The Stars. Last year, Gary finished in 9th place with a 2-15 record. It was a shortened schedule because of the follow-up to the pandemic season, but basically the only thing that's going to change record-wise here is the fact that he's going to lose an extra 2 games. 2 more games gives him a chance to win a few more than he did last year, but ultimately it seems like it's going to be a struggle for the Stars to get even one victory this season. But before we go any further and deep dive on Gary's upcoming season, let's get this out of the way right now so we don't have to address it again. I was wrong about Mike Conley, okay? To be fair, he had an abysmal first season on the Jazz, which saw him on the waiver wire the entire year. I expected a repeat of that, and he was just getting older and things just were not looking good. He also 1000% didn't deserve that All-Star nod and only averaged 20 fantasy points, which is solid, but it's not outstanding or anything. But still, with all that being said, I roasted Conley and Gary for selecting him, and I was proved wrong, so there you go. During Season 2, however, we were all able to take a step back and give Gary a break since Karthik was fired from the Stars front office with Mr. Marva hired to replace him and fix the mess that GM Yadavar created. Basically, Gary took control of a team he had no say in whatsoever, but now a full season has gone by and that excuse won't cut it anymore. It's all on Gary's shoulders to do right by the organization and create a winning culture. Based on last year's evidence and what we've seen so far this year, it doesn't look so much like that's going to happen. Although eager to initially make moves and shake up Karthik's original roster to head in a new direction after a few trades to begin last season, Gary didn't do much of anything to ever actually find that direction. I don't blame him for testing the waters and seeing how his team would perform, even though it seemed fairly evident his roster was not a contender or even a team with playoff aspirations, but I predicted Dennis Schroeder's biggest fan to finish in 8th, and I was actually too kind with that projection. Alas, towards the end of the season, he seemed to realize it was time to blow it up and rebuild, making moves to get a plethora of draft picks and a future star in Darius Garland. But then that all seemingly went out the window because Gary traded a spot back in the first round from pick 4 to number 5 for an extra 2022 second round pick. Not a horrible trade or anything, but then Gary traded away his 5th overall pick that he just received for Kawhi Leonard. 2021 was a loaded draft class that a team like the Stars could have heavily benefited from. Even swapping from 4 to 5 could make a massive difference in losing out on somebody, and we'll get to an example of that later. But for now, to completely lose out on the first round and even the lottery might prove detrimental to Gary's success. This is a loaded draft class that could have originally gotten Gary a guy like Jalen Suggs, Scotty Barnes, Jarrett Allen, or Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Hell, even Chris Paul would have been better than Kawhi Leonard since Kawhi's going to miss practically, if not the whole season. So I'm not really sure what he was thinking there unless he's absolutely positively certain he's going to be contending in 2023. Let's take a look at Gary's keepers. Personally, I only like 2 of Gary's keepers, and that's me still being iffy on Mr. Glass Anthony Davis. Mitchell Robinson is okay, but he's going to be injured to start the year, and although he's still got that potential, it still mostly hasn't really been tapped into. Kawhi's a great player, but I wouldn't want him even if he didn't tear his ACL and was going to miss a year because he regularly sits out and rests games anyway. Miles Turner and Jeremy Grant are great if you're a contender and they fill out the bench of your role players, but as some of the best healthy talent on your team, not really. And I've said it time and again with Klay Thompson, but he's never been a good fantasy player. All he can do is shoot. He doesn't get rebounds, assists, or even consistently huge scoring nights. Let's not forget to mention he missed the past 2 whole years, so the Warriors are going to sit him out back-to-backs and ease him into game action for the whole season. Not only would I not keep him, I wouldn't have drafted him if he was available. Lastly, TJ Warren is a question mark, but like basically everyone on the Stars, he's injury prone and going to be out to start the year. These are not ideal keepers for a team that should be rebuilding or that's going to finish this low. Heading over to Gary's draft, though, things get kind of worse. With his first pick outside the lottery at number 17, Gary selected Spencer Dinwiddie. This isn't a bad pickup at all, but I can't really get a read on Gary's vision. Most of his team are win-now type players, but they're not really win-now caliber. They're mostly players that have hit their peak or don't have a lot of upside. Dinwiddie could be in Washington, but is this someone Gary's trying to invest in, trade to a contender for value, or simply just fill a roster spot? 2 picks later was the silver lining in his draft, though, with selecting Sadiq Bey. The Pistons are young, and Bey should continue to improve after a more than impressive rookie season, but there's a good chance he has an average season in only his second year. But in the third round, Gary proved why he's Dennis Schroeder's biggest fan after seemingly admitting that it'd be a bad idea to take him, then mere seconds later saying fuck it and taking him. Now, Schroeder had a down season with the Lakers and could be pretty solid in Boston as he tries to ball out for another contract, but Schroeder will also never be more than a 20 fantasy point per game scorer max, at this point at least. I mean, I don't see Dennis Schroeder becoming a truly significant part of any NBA team soon from a fantasy perspective, so to me this is just a wasted pick. Lastly, 20 picks later at 44, Gary took the cum bucket in Jonathan Kaminga. This is more like the kind of selections Gary should have been making, like young guys, rookies, and those with potential, since he's not going to be in a position to make the playoffs anyway. Might as well feel out all the young guys and plan for the future. Kaminga could be good, but also, in Golden State, his minutes and role are a little unclear. Regardless, him and Bay were good choices, but they're the direct opposite moves from Schroeder and Spencer. You may be wondering, well, what was Gary's 5th pick or selection in the follow-up draft? And to that I say, nothing, because he only had 4 draft picks and didn't participate in the follow-up draft. That's not good. Gary had a pretty solid draft last season, but didn't garner much love in awards voting because he opted into just skipping his final pick. He had 5, so he was all set, but that's still an incomplete draft technically. This time, it really was incomplete as he only had 4 total selections, and as of the recording of this video, hasn't picked someone else up. I think it's pretty safe to assume that Gary is one of the very early frontrunners for the 2022 All-Dumbass team, and if he continues to make puzzling moves and be forgetful about important organizational matters, you may as well pencil it in now. If I were the Stars, I'd be shopping AD around and listening for the best offers because it just seems like it's time to blow it up for good. That seems like it seems like it'd be in the team's best interest, but it also is a lose-lose for Gary since he traded for Kawhi and has other veterans like Klay Thompson sitting on his bench, and nobody's going to trade for Kawhi when they know he's missing the whole season. It's just a frustrating start to the year for Gary, but I believe he has the potential to turn things around and build an interesting future. However, as far as his current moves and decisions go, it doesn't look like it's going to happen this season. Coming in 9th place is going to have to be the Kentucky Cuckies. It may be discouraging for Cam to feel like he's improved his roster and start a new year fresh, only to hear that his team is predicted to finish worse than the season before, but I do think his record and team are going to improve and showcase the future juggernaut that Kentucky will be. Last year, Cam finished in 8th place with a 4-13 record. A lot of that was due to unfortunate injuries, which basically caused Cam to go into a full-on rebuild, and while injuries are always still possible, the only reason Cam is going to finish so low is because his team is full of young guys and rookies that haven't hit their stride yet. Cam made the All-Dumbass team for the first time in his career last season, but honestly, I don't think it was really warranted. If you go based off of record, well, Gary and CJ were even worse. If you go off of trades, well, he only had 1 or 2 that were bad out of the monsoon of deals he completed, and most of them were beneficial for his rebuild. To call a manager that worked that hard to plan for the future amidst a tidal wave of injuries when he had more wins than the 2 teams below him put together an All-Dumbass select, and they weren't, is a little puzzling. I'm not saying Cam was anywhere near an all-fantasy level, as all things considered he had a bad season, but other than a premature reaction to Anthony Edwards early in the season and a few meaningless trades that did nothing, I have trouble finding fault in the Cuckies' last outing. Cam got some great young keepers like Jaylen Brown and Isaiah Stewart, an endless array of draft picks, and he easily walked away with the best draft trophy as he was able to snag Edwards, JJJ, Colin Sexton, and Tyrese Halliburton. That's extremely impressive, and what's more impressive is that at this moment, he's the clear frontrunner to go back-to-back. But before we check out his draft, let's take a look at his keepers. I may not be the biggest fan of all of these guys, but at least you can look at Cam's team and say every one of these guys is not only young, but has a chance to be good, if not special. Unlike Gary, he doesn't have veterans or old guys and has clearly established his identity, which makes the direction he takes his team in that much clearer. Jaylen Brown is an obvious lock and will be one of those moves I'll just always regret. Anthony Edwards is also an obvious lock, and although Cam played a game of tennis with him for a bit, he's got a chance to be a dynamic scoring star. I don't love Halliburton myself, but he's still an obvious keeper. I'd compare Halliburton to Malcolm Brogdon, a more low-key Rookie of the Year candidate that can play defense, shoot, and kind of do it all. I don't think he'll ever be a superstar or even star player really, and I know that's early to say, but I think he'll follow Brogdon's career path of growth every year until he just becomes a really good player. Colin Sexton is underrated though, because he averaged 24 points per game last year and no one ever talks about it. Sure, he's a little inefficient and can't really play make or rebound, but let's not forget he's only entering year 4. He very well may bump that scoring up to 26 or 27 points per game. Stewart showcased in limited minutes last year that he could put up big fantasy relevant numbers, and with the Pistons committed to a full-on rebuild, I don't see why they'd play Kelly Olynyk over him. He should be really good. Now, Kevin Porter Jr. is a streaky player, but he's already made a name for himself as someone to watch, and he's only entering his 3rd season as well. He could be in for a big year with the, rebuilding Rockets. My least favorite keeper is JJJ, because I just don't like a big guy that averages under 7 rebounds, and JJJ has averaged under 5 rebounds, consistently. That's not good, especially in a fantasy basketball landscape, but he still has all the tools to become an elite player if he actually manages to stay on the court. Lastly, we've got Wiseman, who didn't play a lot, barely played in college, had no summer league or training camp, and was expected to be the third option to help lead the Warriors back to the playoffs. Then he tore his ACL. He's had some unfair expectations and situations damper his rookie year, and even though I don't think he's amazing, the potential is still clearly there as long as he's given the playtime. The Cookies are one of the few teams where I don't have a problem with a single keeper. Like I said, I don't think they're all great, but they make sense and fit Cam's timeline. You pair all these guys with Cam's juicy draft pick selections, including the first 3 picks in Cade Cunningham, Jalen Green, and Evan Mobley, not to mention the possible breakout year of Mchale Alexander-Walker as well as Wendell Carter Jr. with a full year in Orlando, you've got yourself one of the most perfectly structured teams in the league. Not all of these guys will pan out, but I think most of us are willing to bet that a good majority of them will, even if it doesn't directly happen this season. Even though I've mostly been praising Cam and he's got a bright future ahead of him, things are still going to be bleak for the time being. Unless all 3 of his first picks are NBA ready immediately and all of his players progress the way that they have the potential to, then Cam will likely finish 9th and be one of those teams you'll be glad you're facing when you've had a tough schedule. I think everything would have to go right just for Cam to be the 7th seed, but he knows this is not a contending year, so there's nothing to stress about. Staying in the Eastern Conference, we're looking at an 8th place finish for the Central and Jamesons. This was a very tough decision to make, so I apologize to my Eastern Conference brother, but out of all the teams left, I think Ants will be the next to fall in line. To me, Gary and Cam's teams kind of stick out as the 2 bottom-tier squads, and then there's a few mid-tier teams that could probably be shuffled around, but my gut says Anthony will be falling back down to earth after his best record tying all fantasy season a year prior. Last year, Anthony's squad was kind of all over the place. At times it seemed like he was rebuilding, and at others it seemed like he wanted to compete. These 2 directions seemed to keep conflicting with each other throughout the course of the season, but it didn't matter as he wound up tying for their best record in the league with Josh, and was a 4th throughout the regular season despite his back-and-forth tendencies. And although Anthony used my projection last year as motivation to fuel him, I still predicted him to finish in 4th as one of the better teams in the league, and that was still higher than where he wound up placing in 6th. He made moves early on last season to help him compete and at least be a playoff team, and that's essentially what happened. I was just more critical of the deals he made and how they seemed to be confusing. If Anthony can buckle down and really pick a side this year, then as long as he sticks to it, there won't be anything bad about this upcoming season other than finishing in 8th. However, some of those inconsistent decisions may have already started to come back up again. Once again, Embiid and Trae Young are the only original members from the Central and Jameson's initial draft, but I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. They're clearly great players. They should be here. The Paul George trade last year, though, was not a good move at all for Anthony at the time, but it seemingly worked out as Kawhi will miss the full year and DeRozan is not the go-to guy and essentially only scoring option in San Antonio anymore. PG-13 should feast this year, but if I was Anthony, I'd let his stock go up and then sell him for a good return. Hunter has the potential to be a nice piece in Atlanta, but I'm not sure how much more he'll improve in fantasy. I honestly know very little about his game, but I'm assuming he's not a good shot creator and he can't distribute the ball well, which makes him a 3-and-D player, and those aren't typically the greatest options in fantasy basketball. However, he's still young, and if he can stay healthy, he can still expand upon the improvement he's already made. I also think Keldon Johnson will be the go-to scoring option in San Antonio with DeRozan out of the picture, and that Olympics run might have helped motivate him even more. Terry Rozier had a shockingly good season last year, but I'm not sure if he'll replicate that again. He may very likely do that, but I still don't think he's a fantastic keeper because I just see him as more of a rental for contenders. Trez had a down season last year as I projected, and he'll likely improve in Washington, but it's still a suspicious rotation. Thomas Bryant will come back soon, followed by Daniel Gafford, as well as the power forward situation that includes Davis Bertans and Rui Hachimura, not to mention Kyle Kuzma. I think Trez is the best player out of all of those guys, but the minutes situation may not be ideal. If Harrell can go back to what he was doing on the Clippers, though, this will be a good keep. Lastly is Darius Bazley, who I drafted last year, but at this point he just seems like a guy getting minutes on the Thunder because they're so young and don't have any good players. I think there's some potential there, and he's very young, but time and again he'd shoot wildly bad, and overall I don't, think this guy is deserving of a keeper spot when there's people with more potential out there. Basically, I think Ant's got a couple of great keepers and a mixed bag of others. None are centerpieces except for Trae Young and Embiid, and not enough of them are young enough to warrant a rebuild with guys like Terry Rozier and Montrezl Harrell filling out the team. But when you keep someone like Darius Bazley, I could only imagine a rebuild is where you're headed. There's an argument to be made why you'd keep all of these players, but altogether the fit doesn't feel as cohesive as, say, the Cookies roster. Moving on to Anthony's draft, it was pretty good for what I think his direction is. At number 7, he took Scotty Barnes, which was an excellent choice and who could provide an immediate fantasy impact. Right after at number 8, he took Tyler Hero, which may have been a stretch in the first round. I'm willing to bet he wouldn't have gone till the 3rd round, and as much as I believe in Tyler Hero, I don't think he's going to be as good as the preseason has been suggesting. I'd love to be wrong about that, and I do think he'll progress, but just not quite the first round material yet. However, at least these guys are both young and fit the rebuild road. Anthony's next pick at number 11 was Andrew Wiggins, who isn't young and has certainly peaked at this point in his career. He's not getting any better than 19 fantasy points per game, and I would have imagined the Jamesons would have wanted to snag some younger talent or rookies rather than Andrew Wiggins' dumbass, especially with the first pick in the second round. He'll have some above average games here and there, but I've personally just been done with Wiggins in fantasy for years, and I stand by that. This is Anthony's only solidified bad selection, in my opinion. His next pick in the lottery at 14 was a pretty solid move, though, as he chose Mchale Bridges. I don't know how high his ceiling really is as a fantasy player, but at 19 fantasy points per game last year, he can definitely improve at still a young age, so I respect this pick. At number 25, the Jamesons went with a bold move in selecting Alperen Sengun of the Rockets. The rookie has flash potential to put up dowdy numbers in limited minutes, but if he doesn't really enter that rotation or get a good workload, he probably won't be worth owning. However, seeing as Anthony's rebuilding, apparently, Sengun is a project worth supporting, but he may not make any noise this season. And with his 6th pick of the draft, he chose Davion Mitchell, who he refuted to keep for his 5 players. But it's a good pick. Mitchell's game is so much like the other D. Mitchell in the league, but the only thing holding him back is that backcourt in Sacramento is the only truly really good players on that team, so his minutes aren't going to be ideal. But I'd imagine he pops off and has some great games and displays the potential that he has. If I were Anthony, I would have dropped Wiggins and kept Mitchell, as this is basically just like the Sengun situation and he's rebuilding, so it just makes the most sense. In the end, Anthony's keepers were a mixed bag for me, but his draft was a pretty solid combination of young guys with potential. Maybe some of them were picked a little higher than needed to be, such as Tyler Hero and Alperen Sengun, but they still fall in line with what I believe Anthony's path is. Andrew Wiggins is a serviceable fantasy player at times, but it doesn't fit with the youth movement going on in Central NJ, just like some of his keepers don't. We'll have to see how things pan out as the year goes on, but due to a more heavily young-aged roster and some differing decisions, my gut is telling me Anthony will have to relocate and change his team name. Next up in 7th place will be the other team in LA, the Los Angeles Clippers. No, the Looney Tunes. It's like, why'd I even say that? It wasn't funny, it wasn't worth saying. But whether CJ finishes higher or even lower than 7th, it's a guarantee that there's nowhere to go but up from last year's dreadful record. At 1-16, CJ finished in last place as he essentially tanked his way to the number 1 pick. He was not an all-dumbass member though, and I'm glad the league saw it that way since he did a pretty admirable job managing his team by making good trades to plan for the future, scouting young talent and rookies from the waiver wire, and supporting his roster from his league Twitter account. However, it was still an abysmal season from a wins perspective, but that will definitely change this year. No, the Tunes aren't exactly a contender, but their roster improvement is noticeable and the direction of the team has certainly shifted. CJ's plan is to probably at least fight for a playoff spot, if not make it in as the 6th seed, and that's exactly how this year will go, barring injury. I envision this season to be a monumental upgrade from the previous one. There's a lot of good teams ahead, so it was hard for me to flat out say CJ was going to make the playoffs, but with the right moves and pieces, he could certainly make an argument for himself. In the offseason, CJ pulled off one of the biggest trades in league history as he landed Karl Anthony Towns and the 4th overall pick in exchange for the first 2 picks in Anthony Edwards. Yes, he missed out on Cade Cunningham and Jalen Green in the process, but receiving a top 5 fantasy player and also still obtaining a top 5 pick was a glorious move. Now he's got a 3-headed monster of Jonas, Towns, and Zion, who will combine for some seriously large fantasy numbers that could almost be enough to win matchups on their own. Now let's take a look at his keepers though to see how the rest of his team stacks up. CJ's keepers are pretty solid for the most part. They're all around the same age and many have potential to continue taking that next step to get even better, but they just still don't all quite stack up to some of the more heavyweight teams' keepers in the league. Rashaan Ho should once again average about 25 fantasy points, which gives the Tunes a secondary star-type player alongside his big 3. OG Anunoby is poised for a most improved type of breakout season, and if preseason is any indication, he's going to be very good. Time Lord has also flashed some serious upside, and imagine he gets the bulk of the minutes at center in Boston, but with Al Horford and Ness Kanter clogging up the rotation, Williams could wind up being less effective than one would hope. PJ Washington had himself a drama-filled offseason, but there's no reason to think he won't continue to get better. He made strides in his second year after an impressive rookie campaign, and now will have every bit of motivation to continue playing hard to get a bag. But his fantasy average will likely linger around 19 or 20 fantasy points still. Lastly, Jonathan Isaac has got a supreme amount of potential, but he's never, ever healthy. That might only continue since he's unvaccinated, but his injury history is really bad, and I don't see a future where he plays more than 50 games. It's unfortunate for as good as he can be with his defensive prowess and improved offense, but unless he's healthy, he'll continue to be useless. Onto the draft, it was kind of subpar. With the 4th pick, you can't blame CJ for picking Jalen Suggs, who has a lot of star potential written all over him. This year will be a very streaky mesh of games for him though, as he'll pop off for some ridiculous numbers and then finish with some negative point totals in other games. Scoring guards like that, who have the keys to the offense in their rookie season, typically start out this way, such as Trae Young and Anthony Edwards, but if he follows their trajectory, then Suggs is going to be a fantastic player. For this season though, especially with Cole Anthony, Markelle Fultz, RJ Hampton, and Michael Carter-Williams sharing the backcourt, I wouldn't depend on him for consistently valuable output. With the 18th pick, the Tunes selected Derek White, who I'm not that sold on personally. He was supposed to break out like 2 years ago, and he still hasn't really done that. Yes, DeRozan's gone, and they need guys to step up and score, so he has the chance to be one of the Spurs' main components of offense, but it's still the Greg Popovich Spurs. Ball movement and balanced scoring is likely for the team, and in my estimation, Keldon Johnson and DeJounte Murray will be the leaders in that category. At 27 years old now, with a lot of backcourt players and roster adjustments, I'm not as big on Derek White as others seemed to be when CJ selected him. At 38, CJ selected one of my least favorite players in recent memory in Mike Conley. I've already gone on about him enough, but he should be decent this year. He only averaged 20 fantasy points last season, and he did just turn 34, so he could be in line for even more regression, but if he remains at 19 or 20 fantasy points, then that'd be a nice little veteran role player for the Tunes. With his 4th pick, CJ took Marcus Smart, and I don't really care about him. I thought last year he'd break out with Kemba Walker sidelined, and he still didn't do that, so that's just not going to happen this year either. He averaged about 18 fantasy points, which isn't bad, but he was pretty inconsistent. In the follow-up draft, we had a bit of a hiccup with the IR draft rules, as everyone knows, so CJ was able to draft 2 players, and even though we should have only drafted 1. These players were the centers. Oh my god, what the hell? I just got an update on my computer. No, you're messing up my audio. Hold up. These players were the centers on the Wizards and Thomas Bryant and Daniel Gafford. These guys both have potential if they play 30 minutes a game, but Bryant is still hurt, and even if he wasn't, then that means one of them isn't playing too much. But it gets even worse when you remember that they have Montrezl Harrell, who's better than both of them. I don't know what's going to happen with that shit, but for some flyers in the follow-up draft, I don't hate it. So the Tunes have definitely improved and have a nice little roster going into Season 3. My belief is that some guys will take big steps like OG and Robert Williams, while the others like PJ Washington and Jonathan Isaac will remain about the same. Still, to have Zion, Jonas, and Cat on the same team is a scary sight, and CJ will be doing everything he can to get them the help they need to further compete for a championship down the line. But this season, he needs to just see how things will play out and try to battle league members for a playoff berth. Unfortunately for CJ's sake, he's going to miss out on the playoffs to the guy that doesn't try or set his lineup, Sam. Yes, in 6th place I have Sam's squad squeaking out the Tunes to make the postseason, and I don't mean to make Sam feel bad or roast him for his long list of mistakes, but last year is probably the worst season I could ever imagine anyone having in our league for the rest of time. I say that because Sam finished in 7th last season, missing the playoffs. If you told me he missed the finals, I would have been shocked, but he missed the playoffs entirely. Listen to the talent on this team. LeBron James, Russell Westbrook, Steph Curry, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Brandon Ingram, Malcolm Brogdon, Jonas Valanciunas, Jarrett Allen, Tobias Harris, DeJounte Murray, Mchale Bridges, and honestly a few other names I'm probably forgetting that all had contracts with Sam's team. There's something else going on behind the scenes here that's more than just injuries and the unlucky bullshit that fantasy basketball can sometimes bring. It's exactly what I predicted in the Season 2 video and why I had Sam not finishing as even a top 4 team. Terrible management. Sam simply doesn't pay enough attention to improve his team. He hardly makes moves on the waiver wire, he only completed 1 trade on the year, which was actually shocking in itself, and he constantly fails to set his lineup, which is a problem that's been plaguing Sam's roster since college. Everyone forgets to set their lineup once in a while here or there, but Sam literally lost a shit ton of matchups because he would go weeks without activating players. He could have finished with like the 2nd best record in the league, but he wound up missing the playoffs because he just wasn't playing his guys. On top of that, he just leave healthy players in his IR, which made it illegal for him to edit his team, and conversely, he wouldn't add injured players to the IR and add free agents in place of them. Other things such as barely trading or picking up players is hurtful to begin with, but it's nothing compared to the monstrosity that is shooting yourself in the foot by not doing the simplest task there is when it comes to managing your team. I love Sam and he's one of my best friends, but he deserves to be criticized for the result of last season. When it comes down to it, he's clearly a knowledgeable NBA fan to have even wound up with the team that he has, but it does no good if he's absent from managing his team day in and day out. What makes everything even worse is that he actually made a trade last season and it actually benefited him a lot. He got Jonas Valanciunas, a 31 fantasy point per game scorer, for a 1st rounder and got a 3rd rounder in return. His 1st rounder should have and would have been somewhere in the 8 to 10 range had he actually paid even little attention to his team, but since he seemingly never even downloaded the app, Sam missed the playoffs, effectively putting his team into the draft lottery, which of course landed him the number 1 pick, which of course then belonged to CJ. Honestly, this is movie-like stuff that sounds made up, but it's what's bound to happen when you don't put any effort into your team. So where do we go from here? I'm hoping Sam watches this and uses it as motivation to fuel him to at least set his lineup the way it fueled Anthony to have a good season last year. Because as much as I love Sam, I do not have any faith in him righting his wrongs and fixing his mistakes. This has been the story time and again with his fantasy teams since I started playing with him in 2014. I think that's enough time to know whether or not someone's going to change. I would love for him to prove me wrong though. I mean, it would not only make the league more fun, competitive, and interesting for everyone else, but it'd also be better for his sake since he's putting time and money into it every year. On that note, however, I don't think anything's gonna change. Sam's keepers are fucking elite, probably the best in the league. Nothing has to be said about LeBron, Westbrook, Curry, SGA, Ingram, or Brogdon, and his other two keepers are also extremely good. But those names have to be brought up based on who he dropped instead. Jarrett Allen and Jonas Valanciunas, two 25-point-plus fantasy options, weren't kept, and I would have kept both of them over Tobias Harris and DeJounte Murray. Sure, they all averaged close to relatively the same fantasy points, except for Jonas, who again averaged 31, but that's just what I would have done. I'm more comfortable dropping Tobias Harris than the other guys. And if he likes the other guys better, that's fine, but you'd think he'd want to get some value for them rather than drop them for nothing, which takes us to Jonas Valanciunas. Had he planned out his keepers or looked into things in advance, he could have gotten a much better deal than what he ended up with. So, the story goes that Sam comes to me on the day of the keeper deadline, like minutes before, essentially, and tells me his keepers so I can drop the other players from his team. And I had to remind him, but bro, I don't do that. You have to manually set them yourself. So 15 minutes before the deadline, I was like, bro, you're dropping Jonas Valanciunas, so I'll give you a 4th rounder for him. And he immediately said deal. Yes, Sam got value for someone he wasn't going to keep, but I would have given him my 2nd rounder at that point for Valanciunas. I mean, I knew I had all the leverage at that moment, and he figured he was getting something for someone he wasn't keeping with 5 minutes till the deadline, so it was an easy steal for me. He could have gotten more for him and something for Jarrett Allen had he actually looked into it, but that didn't happen, which is a sign for what's to come this season. Anyway, his keepers are still insanely good, so when it comes to analyzing them for who they are, they're top tier. Now comes the draft, which doesn't really help Sam's chances at all. Last year, outside of the obscure choice of Jalen Smith, Sam had a pretty rock-solid draft. Jarrett Allen, Mchale Bridges, and Bogdanović were all serviceable to fantastic. This time around, though, I don't think things will pan out so well. Sam didn't pick until back-to-back at 20 and 21, and he went with Brook Lopez and Rui Hachimura. Brook is like... he had some games where he popped off last year on Ish's team, which felt like only happened whenever he was playing me, but the fact of the matter is he's just not that good anymore. Rui can be good, but he's also out for personal reasons right now, and the Wizards don't know when he'll return. Not the best sign, but I also have PTSD from owning Kyrie Irving for 4 months, so that probably plays into it, but even if and when he does play, Rui has proven injury-prone history at this point, and Kyle Kuzma is, and he's there, and there's just a long list of forwards that go cut into the rotation, so I don't know what to expect from him. Shortly after, at 23, Sam chose Kevin Love, and that's not good. Last year was like the last chance for Caleb to prove he can stay healthy and still put up numbers. He 1000% couldn't stay healthy, and when he did play, he clearly regressed and, just not putting up those numbers. So now the Cavs have a youth movement going on, and they have like 5 billion forwards and centers that are a higher priority than him, so he's not going to play a lot due to being last in the pecking order and because he literally is always injured. So bad pick. At 32, Sam got Killian Hayes, which may be his best pick of the draft. Hayes was pretty bad last year, but also he wasn't really healthy, and he is a rookie. He's a rookie, so it's like you kind of cut him some slack, but maybe we'll see some solid improvement this season. But for a contender like Sam, it's not really the best player to choose anyway. Even so, I think Cunningham is going to steal the show in Detroit. Then, back-to-back again, Sam chose his Nets boys in Claxton and Cam Thomas. Claxton has the chance to put up numbers if he gets solid time, but there's just no way he will, right? Unless a lot of injuries happen. Cam Thomas looks to be the steal of the NBA draft, but I can't imagine him being a consistent array of fantasy points in any way this season. If this team was in Gary or Cam's situation, I'd be fine with these moves, but Sam has the single most win-now team in the league, and these selections are certainly not supporting that notion. You may also realize that Sam picked 6 people, and if you did, then you caught on what Sam didn't even realize himself. I know the draft got crazy with the whole IR pick situation, so I put everyone on Sam's team anyway after putting one of his players in the IR, but he's going to have to drop someone eventually. When it's all said and done, Sam's got a great overall team that could have used a better draft to help him compete, but at the end of the day, we know that doesn't really matter anyway since he's not going to set his lineup or make any other effort to actually win. I may sound harsh, but at this point, it's just the truth as opposed to an assumption. Even though he's going to repeat all of his mistakes, I found it incredibly hard to believe a team of this caliber would miss the playoffs again, even without ever activating his players. CJ may overtake him for the last playoff spot, but I'm going to guess Sam still makes it in, even if it's not entirely deserved for the reigning dumbass of the year. Coming in 5th place is going to be the guy that ceases to exist, Ish. Now last year, I said Ish was going to come in last place because like Sam, he doesn't ever participate in any trades or pay much attention, all while having what seemed like a pretty bad team overall. I did not expect his players to take the leaps that they did, such as Jokic shooting up to nearly 27 points per game and winning the MVP, Julius Randle having a Larry Bird All-NBA season, Chris Paul missing only 2 games all season after being healthy the year prior as well, and being a notoriously injury-prone player his whole career, and Draymond Green having a nice little bounce-back season where he got himself a lot of triple singles. But other than them and De'Aaron Fox, Ish's team was pretty bad. His keepers were all pretty decent for the most part, but his supporting cast and drafted players were not going to put him in the upper echelon of fantasy teams. And they didn't, but they certainly contributed to him being a good team overall, which gave me my most inaccurate projection last year. Also, like Sam though, Ish was voted to the all-dumbass team. A guy that went 10-7 and scored 950 plus points since mid-February and nearly capsized my team in the postseason was considered an all-dumbass. That's because for the second year in a row, Ish did not complete a single trade. This would have helped his team to contend or make the finals, considering his team was that good without making any other moves prior. On top of that, he stole Sam's flow by forgetting to set his lineup a number of times, which actually caused him a few matchups. It wasn't to the extent of Sam's woes, but it was still a considerable amount of time that cost him. Ish could have potentially had a case for all fantasy, but ruined it with an unwillingness to be more involved in the league. When it comes to Ish's third venture into the DBL, I don't think anything is really going to change. Again, like Sam, he's basically proven at this point that he's set in stone as the manager he is. However, he actually did complete a trade in the offseason, which might be a sign that he's improving in that department, but I wouldn't be shocked if that's all we see out of him this year. It was a move that bolstered up his team and gave him some of the best keepers in the league by acquiring my Bucks premium package of Chris Middleton and Drew Holiday. Speaking of his keepers, let's check them out. Jokic, Randall, and Fox are obvious locks, and like I said, Middleton and Holiday gave Ish the keepers he desperately needed to fill out his team. LeVert should also be in line for some more improvement, although he's once again injured, which doesn't bode well for his stock moving forward. D'Lo had an underwhelming season last year, but if he can stay healthy for a whole campaign, he could be in for about 23 or 24 fantasy points. And although Draymond might have been pretty good last year, I'm still not quite sold on him as a keeper. He's getting older and he's just not efficient, but if he still manages to stuff the stat sheet up, then it's not a bad keep at all. However, Ish dropped Chris Paul, and even though I believe that was the right move because of what I said about him earlier, he didn't even attempt to get anything for him. I mean, maybe he did, but I doubt it. Had he come to me, I would have given him a third rounder easily. May sound like a ripoff, but if you're not keeping him, it's a free draft pick. So that's an example of what Ish needs to focus on if he wants to be more than just a mid-tier team in this league. Once again, however, Ish's draft was not too enticing. It wasn't bad, I'd say, it was just an average draft. He didn't have his first or second rounder, so with the 26th pick, he chose Steven Adams, which is probably a pretty alright pick. Adams was not that good in his lone season with the Pelicans, barely getting double-doubles and only averaging 18 fantasy points. Preseason with the Grizzlies so far, he's looked better, but, if Adams could get that number up to about 21 fantasy points or so, I'd say this was a great pick then. I know 3 fantasy points doesn't really make much of a difference, but there's still a chance he could regress based off of his performance last season. At 34, Ish selected Kuzmo, which isn't horrible given the new environment in Washington, but again, that forward rotation looks to be pretty clogged, so I don't know how things are going to go, but it's not an awful choice in the 4th round. And in the 5th, Robert Covington is streaky but also not horrible selection for the 46th pick. In the follow-up, Ish took both Kelly Oubre and Al Horford. From a glance, this isn't a bad draft, but Ish basically went with old, proven veterans for every pick. He essentially went safe with every choice, and in some cases, risky considering a lot of these guys like Horford, Oubre, and Adams could regress. Like I said, it's a fine draft, and they may all be serviceable to good, but this isn't going to win Ish best draft or anything. To put it bluntly, Ish has a pretty above-average squad and great keepers, but because of Ish's typical tendencies, he's not going to make any more noise this season than he did the past 2 years. His team can be scarily good at times with the likes of Jokic and Randall amassing crazy triple-doubles, but without any extra reinforcements from the manager himself, Ish is going to remain a middle-of-the-road, first-round exit type of club. Finishing in 4th place is where we shift back over to the Eastern Conference in the Peach Creek Oof Magoos. Last year's most improved is set to improve once again and jump from a 4th place finish with a 9-8 record to a 4th place finish, but with a 12-7 record. Last season, Gio and the Magoos shocked the league by finishing with a positive record, making the playoffs, and even getting to the semifinals. It was a fantastic turnaround for Peach Creek after debuting in the DBL with a 3-16 record in year 1. Gio's players and management style both improved, and I think we're likely to see more progress in those areas as well. Last season, Gio only completed one trade that saw him swap Jeremy Lamb for Jabari Parker, an absolutely meaningless trade. He was always eager to trade but could never seem to pull the trigger and get deals done. But with 3 under his belt this past year, he took more chances and actually tried to better his roster. With his first swap, he received RJ Barrett. He gave up a future first-rounder and third-rounder, and it's still too early to tell if he overpaid, but with a lot of faith in the talent of Barrett, Gio has one of the Knicks' future centerpieces on his team. While he may have given up too much for someone we're not sure is going to necessarily pan out, you have to admire that he at least went for it. However, he may hit the panic button with his next trade, where he desperately seeks to dump Mitchell Robinson once he got hurt. It seemed a bit premature for a guy that certainly has Rudy Gobert-esque fantasy value, but at the same time, he hadn't been performing all that well in his past 2 seasons, and this very well could be the best version we see of Robinson. Plus, since he got hurt, it was evident that Magoos were trying to make a playoff push this season, and they couldn't afford for another player to go down like that. But Gio only got a wimpy little 4th rounder out of the deal, and it seems like that isn't enough value for a player with the fantasy potential Robinson has. And at the deadline, Gio finally got his wish of reuniting the Ball brothers by trading Jamal Murray and a 2nd rounder for Lonzo. While I'm sure Gio was ecstatic to finally get these two together, it was definitely a bit of an overpay. Lonzo continues to have that up and down fantasy value where he looks like he'll put up baby Westbrook stat lines, and other days he looks like he's going to be Chris Dunn. So he's very streaky, and Gio gave up the better player in my opinion, as well as a 2nd rounder to acquire him. So I don't know. Lonzo could certainly be great, but so could Murray. I know Murray tore his ACL, so Gio probably had to throw in that pick to sweeten the deal. And he was also eyeing a playoff push again, so it wasn't a bad move, but I don't think he necessarily won this trade, at least not yet. However, at least Gio actually had the guts to get deals done last season, and I hope that continues into this year. If he does, I'd actually go as far as to say Gio's team is a dark horse to win it all. That being said, he's got a lot of work to do in a trio of stellar fantasy teams that lie ahead of him. I said this to Gio at the awards ceremony, but he's got some of the best keepers in the league. I know I've said that for like the past 3 teams, and I'm likely to say it again for the next 3 as well, but the Magoo mainstays are no joke. Jason Tatum, LaMelo Ball, and DeAndre Ayton are already so good and still aren't near their primes. Clint Capella is a fucking monster as long as he's healthy, and even though he gave up 2 firsties to acquire him, this is probably the best deal the Magoos have made yet. And let's not forget Christian Wood, who is also a beast if he can remain on the court. Moving over to Ben Simmons, however, presents itself with a number of challenges. We all know the Simmons situation, and then none of us know how it's going to play out, so that's a problem in itself, but even if you disregard that, Ben is injury prone and hasn't improved since his rookie year. In fact, his numbers all kind of took a little bit of a step back. Before this whole mess happened with Simmons in Philly, Gio was looking to move him at last season's trade deadline before Simmons' stock went even lower with his awful playoff performances. Now, I think we're all aware Simmons is still a good player and can be a fantastic fantasy option, especially in a new environment, but the criticisms are more than fair. His game hasn't improved, so Gio can either hold on to him and see what happens, and if he stays with the Sixers, I really can't imagine he'll play well, or he can ship him out for the lowest common denominator value back since his stock is at an all-time low. I wouldn't trade him for now at this point unless he'd accept a 3rd rounder for him. I understand he doesn't want to lose him for bad value, especially if he comes back and becomes the superstar we all expected to become seasons ago, but also, trading Kyrie was like the best decision of my Dynasty career. Like, my head is so much clearer and I don't have to deal with that stupidity anymore. I also got like a pretty great package out of it, so there's nothing to complain about really, but it could be a silver lining if you're able to work out the right deal, but you gotta act fast. Now moving on to RJ Barrett, I want him to be really good. I'm a Knicks fan, so believe me when I say that, but he is probably the worst keeper here in terms of this season's output. I think he'll improve to about 20 and 5, which is really solid for a third-year player, but from a fantasy perspective, I think we're looking at about 19 fantasy points, which is doable, but not close to elite. Rounding out the keepers, though, is Lonzo, who should have a career resurgence in Chicago. Yes, he's sharing the ball with 3 other All-Stars, but if his numbers don't improve this season, then I'd pretty much completely write him off as a valuable fantasy commodity. Still highly functional as a 20 to 22 fantasy point guy, maybe, but if it's not higher than that, I don't think we'll ever really see an All-Star version of Lonzo. Still, these are great keepers, especially if Ben winds up playing soon. And Gio didn't have a bad draft either, considering he didn't pick until late in the 3rd round, but I'm not sure it's enough to really compensate for the heavy hitters of Maryland, New Jersey, and whatever James' team location is. At number 27, Gio got back his old friend in Marvin Bagley as if he kept him as a 9th keeper. Not a bad pick for a late 3rd because he's still young and anything's possible, but I've pretty much wrote him off, which I know is stupid this early in his career, but I just don't care about him anymore. However, if he pans out, it's a great pickup for the Magoos. At 33, Gio went with Davonte Graham, which is a pretty solid pick. He was not really good last year, and I don't think he's going to replicate the 17 and almost 8 assists from 2 seasons prior, but in a new environment, he could certainly provide a decent fantasy repertoire. Back to back at 36 and 37, Gio went with Thad Young and Buddy Hield. Thad Young is in the Spurs system to me, that just doesn't sound like he's going to be as good as he was last year at almost 20 fantasy points, but if he gets the minutes, then the 3-position player is definitely a good look. I haven't been big on Buddy Hield for years now, and after a down season of only 17 fantasy points last year, I'm even less enthused about him. He's basically a shooter and nothing else, and with a potential 3-guard lineup of Fox, Mitchell, and Halliburton, his minutes might continue to tumble. Lastly, at 47, Gio took a flyer on Cam Reddish, who flashed his potential in the playoffs last season, but odds are he's not going to keep that up or get starters minutes to really warrant having him on the team. Overall, the Oof Magoo should be on their way to a top 5 record in the league and continue to be on the come up as one of the best teams in the DBL. I don't think his entire roster is enough to compete with the big boys ahead of him, but he should be giving them a run for their money at the same time. On the flip side, Gio still has to continue to improve. There's an argument to be made that he lost all 3 of the trades he made last season, and even though he finally did get some deals done, talking to the Peach Creek front office can be headache-inducing at times. Look, we all want to make trades with the other team where we absolutely fleece them, but this seems to be Gio's mentality every time I receive an offer from him. I don't know if the rest of the league feels that way, but I've yet to be selected to an all dumbass team, so I don't really like to be offered trades where I'm viewed as a dumbass. If anything, I should probably, be sending those to him since he was the reigning dumbass of the year. However, in this offseason, his Capella trade made his team a lot scarier, so he seems to be more on the ball with things. Pun intended, obviously. Maybe just with incidents, though, like with the Mitchell Robinson situation, Gio will act too fast and hit the panic button, so if he works out these kinks and continues to get better with negotiating trades, he could be in the running for most improved once again. Rounding out the top 3 with a 3rd place finish is going to have to be James. For the 3rd season in a row, James will be one of the titans of the Dynasty Basketball League and will continue to search for that elusive ring that the pandemic swiped from him in year 1. Obviously, though, I don't think he's going to get it this season, and I'll explain why in a moment. Last season saw James finish in 2nd place with his 2nd Western Conference title as he sailed through his division with complete ease. The only real competition in his conference never set his lineup and wound up missing the playoffs, so he had nothing to worry about. However, it's that kind of nonchalant attitude that I feel is James' biggest downfall. The league drastically improved last year, seeing 4 to 5 different contenders battling it out every week, whereas our inaugural season only had about 2 elite teams, and James was pretty much locked in to win that championship regardless. Even though James was still the favorite heading into year 2, I don't think he realized all the enhanced teams the DBL had. He went on record at the start of the season saying that we should switch and randomize the conferences because the West was so much more difficult. This obviously promoted league uproar and the now famous Eastern Conference motto, East Run the League. For James to say that, though, in my opinion, was not only disrespectful to the Eastern Conference, but showed that he didn't actually follow closely enough to understand that our league was about to be really competitive. If he did, he would have seen that Karthik set the Los Angeles Stars up for failure, the Looney Tunes were headed for a rebuild, Ish did nothing to change his team, and Sam is Sam. With that notion, I believe James was kind of like the Kevin Durant Warriors where they eventually wound up just coasting through the season without any worry about the rest of the league, and that's where he messed up because that little bit of cockiness got in the way and prevented him from making the necessary moves to cement himself as a champion. James has a lot of talent on his roster, and for the most part, when he completes trades, he seems to come out victorious. But he also seems to be stubborn with draft picks and future assets. Josh overpaid to help him get over the hump, and he won because of it. I tried the same thing with Kyrie, and it didn't work out for me, but I at least went for it seeing the position I was in. Maybe it wouldn't have worked out for Josh had James done it himself. You get rid of some of those okay to solid players that fill out your roster for some great ones to assist your pursuit of winning a championship. But like Gio, James can sometimes be insufferable to talk trades with. He obviously wants to come out the winner of each trade, but we all do. There has to be a middle ground or at least some kind of negotiation to further discuss things, but it always seems to be James offering the absolute minimum in return for the absolute max. James is obviously a fantastic fantasy player and a really cool guy, but if he can tighten up his trade offers and really go for the title by being less reserved with his assets, then there's no telling how many championships this man can win. James' keepers were not too heavily altered, so like last year, this is an amazing list of guys. Harden, Lillard, Beal, Bam, and MPJ go without saying. FVV should also flourish even more now that Lowry's gone, and John Collins is still young enough to transform into a nightly double-double threat. I'm not big on Murray, mostly because he's going to be out like the whole season, but he's just never really brought it in fantasy. He's an elite playoff performer and a good player in real life, but his game hasn't necessarily translated to fantasy since he's basically just a score-first player. It wasn't a bad trade since James didn't want to keep Wendell fucking Carter Jr. Believe me, James, you didn't want to make the same mistake I did last year when I could have had Jaylen Brown. These are great keepers, unfortunately just not as good as last year since James doesn't have Andre Drummond, who was like a top 5 fantasy asset, but nobody really expected him to be waived for being unplayable. That seriously hurt his team last year, in addition to constant injuries, but I'd say 70% of the league was plagued by health issues last season, so that wasn't just him. When it comes to the draft, James is definitely in the running for the 2022 best draft. In a loaded draft class, James had 3 picks in the lottery and 2 back-to-back first-rounders at 9 and 10. Here he selected CJ McCollum and Jakob Poeltl. CJ is the staple for being just a solid fantasy player that'll never be more than what he is as long as he's playing second fiddle in Portland. That's still about 22 or 23 fantasy points, and then you add on Jakob Poeltl, who I prayed I'd be able to snag at number 15, and you've already got yourself a fantastic draft. He's going to average like 25 fantasy points with a double-double and 2 blocks a night. At number 12, James went for my other big man from last season and Chris Boucher. Just to suck my own dick a bit, I drafted him last year at 49 and now he went in the lottery. Nobody wanted him or Jakob when I tried to trade them, and they'll both be low-key very good this season and both win in the lottery, so I think I know what I'm doing, okay? As long as Boucher mirrors his workload from last year, he'll be solid, but it could make for a frustrating own, as I've experienced that. Then at 16, James got another great veteran in Gordon Hayward. Sure, injury prone as fuck and getting older, but for a team with championship aspirations like James, these are the right kind of moves to make. Next, he went with Tyrese Maxey, who's, he's got the upside, but it's still a risky investment. He might be better off trying to trade him into a rebuilding squad since he doesn't align with those championship aspirations, but he could be pretty good. Mason Plumlee, another one of my pickups from last year, thanks for secretly telling me how much you loved everything I did last season, James, is very good when he gets the minutes. When he started and actually played 30 minutes a game on the Pistons, Plumlee was like a 24 fantasy point stud. However, his minutes got disjointed by the end of the year, and I think the same thing's going to happen in Charlotte, and I think that's kind of going to happen from the start. I don't even think he starts unless PJ Washington starts at the 4 and Miles Bridges comes off the bench, but either way, he's going to be, a little of concern to get a bulk of the playtime, but he has shown he can still perform decently in a small workload. Then James went with two Thunder guys, Poku and Isaiah Roby, and honestly, just like with anyone on the Thunder other than SGA, it's a guessing game who's going to be good. No one's locked into a starting spot, and we don't know who the hell is going to improve. But James, he had to drop Roby anyway and elected to hold on to Poku. He, like many others on the Thunder, has shown the ability to put up great fantasy lines when he plays, but the biggest question is whether or not he will. Overall, it was the literal last two picks for these guys, and he's got the pop people in his IR anyway, so who cares, take a flyer on that late, you might as well. So this was just a great draft for an already great team. Bravo, James. In the end, it was a toss-up whether or not to predict James first, second, or third, because you could probably swap out any of these teams on any given day, and I'd agree with you, but I predicted James first last year, and I think second in our debut season, so naturally this time around he gets the third spot. Mainly though, I just think James needs to be more aggressive in his pursuit of a championship and less stubborn with his draft picks and trade discussions. James is still a more than competent fantasy owner who finished in second place and managed to get back-to-back conference titles, so there's no denying the talent and skill he has as a manager. He just needs to implement them more this season if he truly wants to make himself the favorite again. Again, these final 2 to 3 teams are really good and hard to 100% accurately pinpoint, but if I have to pick someone for second place, I'm going to go with the reigning champion in the Maryland McLovins. What else can I say about Josh's preceding year that we don't already know? He practically swept the awards, winning GM of the Year, Trader of the Year, All-Fantasy, and MVP, while coming in second place for Most Improved as the Eastern Conference champion, and of course winning the biggest trophy of all in the process. It's going to be hard for anyone to have a better season in the rest of the DBL's tenure, as Josh went from an all-dumbass selection in year 1 to being crowned champion just a season later. What helped was how much of a transformation he made from a managerial standpoint. The McLovins' first season had Josh missing the beginning of the draft, completing some pretty horrendous trades, including getting rid of Karl Anthony Towns in a package that got him Victor Oladipo, and he just seemed unaware of how to accurately scout fantasy talent. But that all changed. In winning Trader of the Year, he was extremely active out of the gates and continued to make move after move to help position his team for glory. It all worked out, even if he had to give up a lot of draft picks and players. He wound up with a championship, and that's what it's all about. On top of becoming a phenomenal trader after dismissing Cat last season, Josh was also instrumental on the waiver wire this past year, snagging Kelly Olynyk quickly after joining the Rockets, where he was putting up near Domantas Sabonis numbers, and Mike Conley after I supposedly forced Gary to drop him, where he remained a pretty above-average fantasy option for a majority of the season. Josh was just on top of everything and barely made any wrong moves, and if he did, he quickly fixed them. So why do I have the only champion in league history coming in second? Well, Josh knows how hard it is to win a championship. To go back-to-back is unheard of. Literally, it hasn't happened because we only have one league champion. But still, that's a tall task. I'm willing to bet at least 70% of the league this year thinks they're contending and has a shot to win. What's crazy is they're not really wrong. I'd say there's 6 teams that could win it all. Anything can happen with the amount of injuries and crazy free agent pickups that gives everyone a shot to compete. And with Josh's injury-prone team and Kyrie, things might not be all peaches and gravy this season. He might be the reigning trader of the year, but his moves thus far don't really back that up. His first transaction was his best when he got rid of the year-long IR player in Kawhi for a top 5 pick and Harrison Barnes. Again, not sure why Gary did that, but this is a good move for Josh even if Kawhi doesn't miss a year. He's always sitting out and load managing, but since he literally won't be playing, he really came out on top here. Unfortunately though, things get a little tricky with the league's first ever 3-way trade. Josh trades away DeRozan for Chris Boucher in a third and doesn't keep Boucher. Wouldn't DeRozan have been the better keeper anyway? Then the massive one comes in, which you can argue Josh wins if things went differently, but they didn't. That's not how they went. Josh traded Vucevic and swapped the 5th pick and the 31st pick for Kyrie Porzingis, the 6th pick and the 48th pick. So yeah, he got 2 elite players for the price of one and only to move down one spot in the draft, but One of those players is likely not playing the entire year and could even retire, and the other player won't play half the year because he's made of glass. I mean, it was my fucking mission to trade Porzingis this offseason. He was not healthy in the Dynasty playoffs. He ruined my chances at a fucking title. Him and Kyrie were the most frustrating players I have ever owned. Then when you take into consideration that this was a phenomenal draft class and that one pick actually made a massive difference because I know Josh also wanted Jarrett Allen, makes things even worse. And the 31st pick he gave up for the 48th is where I picked Josh Giddy, who Josh also really wanted. So anything could happen with any of these trades. KP could be an MVP for all we know. Vucevic could suck ass. Anything's possible, but as it stands, Josh now has Kyrie Irving's unvaccinated, unplayable ass, and that's an L right there. Obviously, though, Josh's keepers are still insane. On paper, this is a fucking crazy team, but when we take a deeper dive, things unfold a little bit. KD's going to be even more lethal with Kyrie gone, but he'll likely rest a lot and miss a decent chunk of games. Obviously, Kyrie won't be playing unless something completely out of left field happens at this point, and Porzingis is probably a top 3 or top 5 injury-prone player in the league. Nurkic has also been very injury-prone as of late and hasn't fully gotten back to his old self, although he's flashed the ability. Jimmy Butler and Gobert have faced an injury history in the past as well, but as long as they can stay healthy, they'll be dominant. Then, the 2-star shooting guards in D. Mitch and D. Book are actually not as good in fantasy as you might think, at least they weren't last year. I mean, they're still 23 plus fantasy points, but you'd think they'd be averaging close to 30. That could definitely change this year as they're still extremely talented and young, but you never know. Regardless, I'm mostly critical of these keepers because of their injury history. If not for that, I really have nothing bad to say at all other than Kyrie. But even facing these injuries last season, Josh still came out victorious, so when you have this much talent, you're always going to have a great chance to win. Sliding over to Maryland's draft, it's a pretty fine draft, I'd say. For instance, I think James and I had pretty good to great drafts on top of our already nice teams. Josh's was just kind of fine, in my opinion, though. With the 6th pick, he got Chris Paul, and while CP is still an all-star that just led his team to the finals, there's a reason why he wasn't kept. He just adds to the list of injury-prone players Josh already has, and only missing 2 games last year and barely any the year before. Well, he's in for a lot of time missed when you factor in his injury history, his age at almost 37, and his numbers are bound to slip up a little bit as well. Still, it's the pick you have to go with as a contender at number 6, but I'd probably look into trading him if possible. Then, Josh didn't pick till 39 and got Andre Drummond, which is an underrated selection. We all know Embiid is going to miss time eventually, and even when Drummond plays only like 18 to 20 minutes per game, he could very likely average 10 and 10 and feast on second units. We'll have to see, as I'm not the most comfortable owning him at this stage in the game, but he might very well be the steal of the draft. At 45 comes Josh's worst pick in Isaac Okoro. Now, I picked him last year, and I was a dumbass for it. I was swayed by a good preseason, and then he was just very useless in the regular season. Can he improve in his second year? Sure, but there's just so many guys on the Cavs that the ball isn't going to go around enough for Okoro to really make a difference. Josh should have went with a more experienced vet in this instance. That's what he did with number 48, where he got old reliable and Harrison Barnes. Barnes actually had one of the best fantasy seasons of his career last year at 21 fantasy points per game, so if he replicates that again, he's a great addition to fill out the McLovin's bench. But he likely won't be averaging over 20 again, but if he can get at least 18, that's a solid pick for 48th in the draft. Then in the follow-up, Josh took Bledsoe, which is fine. I was thinking about him a little because I don't really know who's going to be the second fiddle in Clipperland, but after a few down years, sorry, I'm reading my notes, I'm a dumbass. After a few down years and Reggie Jackson, in the way too, I just avoided Bledsoe, so I don't know. But he could be really good and provide great value for where he was selected, or he could just be the same Eric Bledsoe as he was the past 2 years. Overall, it was a decent draft for the McLovins as they got some great talent in Chris Paul, even if he has some question marks, a steal or two in Drummond and Barnes, a mediocre pick in Bledsoe, and a pretty bad one in Okoro. But the draft is always the most impossible part of the offseason to analyze because you never really know what's going to happen with anyone till the season's over. Although Josh had some head-scratching decisions and an injury-riddled roster, there's simply no way you can count out the reigning MVP and champion. No matter what happens, Josh is going to be a force to reckon with as he battles it out in hopes of going back-to-back. So that leaves first place for the unbiased commissioner's team in the New Jersey Knights. Yes, I'm predicting myself for first place because I'm an asshole. In our debut season, I said I'd come in 7th, okay, so let me finger myself a little bit. Like I said, James, Josh, and I could all be easily swapped for one another, and I wouldn't raise my eyebrows about it, but I have a lot of confidence in myself this year, and I really like the moves I've made up to this point. Last season, I finished in third with a 12-5 record. I was right underneath my fellow all-fantasy teammates for best record in the Eastern Conference bye, but unfortunately a lot of injuries disparaged my ability to get there in the final weeks of the season. I'm not the only one that faced considerable health problems though, as most teams in the league were ravaged by such incidents. I almost lost to Ish in the first round of the playoffs because of so many of these injuries though, but luckily my team bounced back when they needed to and showed why I should continue to have faith in my guys. I made a lot of moves last season, a lot of great under-the-radar trades like getting Chris Middleton and Drew Holiday to spice up my chances at winning. I picked up some seriously valuable guys on the waiver wire too, like Darius Garland, Kevin Porter Jr., and Mason Plumlee, to name a few. This shows the scouting department of the Knights organization is definitely elite, but perhaps the development department is not as good. Tyler Hero and Ja Morant didn't really take steps forward, and I counted on them doing so as two of my keepers. Switching gears though, of course my most publicized and scrutinized trade was the big package I gave away to acquire Kyrie Irving before the deadline. In hindsight, obviously a huge mistake, and I did the math. Garland would have gotten me more fantasy points than Kyrie did in the playoffs anyway, so it was just a complete dumpster fire since I gave away Garland 2 firsts and a third. It did not work out, but like I mentioned earlier, Josh did the same thing for Gobert and it gave him a championship. I at least went for it, and you have to admire the fact that I realized the position my team was in and tried to help the Knights make that championship push. Again, if I could do that trade over, I would do it in a fucking heartbeat, but at the same time, it was that kind of thinking that helped me finish in second for GM of the year. This season, I had an abundance of keeper-worthy players and wound up getting something from most of them. I shipped away my Bucks for 2 lottery picks in this year's loaded draft class, I got DeRozan for essentially a third rounder since I wasn't keeping Boucher, and I got my third bull in Nikola Vucevic while getting rid of Kyrie and Porzingis, which was probably the best part of the trade in itself. These moves helped me solidify my keepers and gave me hope for the outcome of this season. This is a very solid core, starting off with Luka and Sabonis, who are just self-explanatory. Ja Morant is also an obvious keeper, but he needs to improve this season. He's a great player, but fantasy-wise he isn't consistent or super big time. After the playoffs, though, where he averaged 30 points and 8 assists, I think it's safe to say he's ready to take that next step. LaVine, on the other hand, was amazing last year, and even though he'll be sharing the court with Lonzo and 2 other All-Stars, which I have, he'll still average about 25, 4, and 4 with possible 50, 40, 90 shooting splits. Speaking of one of those All-Stars, Vucevic's numbers will go down a little bit, but we're still looking at 30 fantasy points per game. And let's not forget that I also stole Valanciunas from Sam, also 30 fantasy points per game, for a 4th rounder. Sure, his numbers will go down a little bit, and Sam wasn't going to keep him, so technically he got value, but that's still highway robbery. When it comes to Siakam, though, I think he's been underrated and overlooked as of late. He's not on the level of Julius Randle or Anthony Davis, but he's going to give you at least 22 points, 7 rebounds, and 4 assists. His biggest problem is inefficiency and streakiness, but he's still an all-star averaging 26 fantasy points per game. And lastly, DeRozan figures to suffer the most from the Bulls ball movement, as he was pretty much all alone in San Antonio, but he should still be very consistent and average around 22, maybe 21 fantasy points. Maybe my keepers aren't as dominant as some of the other guys in the league, but they're a well-rounded group with no bad players here. When it comes to my draft, I think I had a pretty excellent outing. Then again, I thought the same thing at the start of last year, and it was a colossal failure and one of my biggest mistakes alongside trading for Kyrie, so I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. But with the 5th overall pick, I was basically guaranteed somebody nice, and I wound up with Jarrett Allen. Sure, there's a little reason to be apprehensive with such a crowded front court, but J.A. played great last year and just got paid $100 million. He is going to get playtime and average at least 25 fantasy points, and he's also still young enough that he can improve and even become a keeper. With the last pick in the lottery at 15, I was eyeing Jakob Poeltl, but James snatched him up from me. However, I was still able to walk away with Kyle Lowry, which is a dynamite pick for number 15. Yes, he's older, he could regress, and he may rest a decent amount of games, but we're still looking at 22 to 23 fantasy points. In the 3rd round, I took a bit of a safe or risky pick, depending how you look at it, as I went with Kemba Walker. Let's not forget, he was a starting all-star just 2 seasons ago. Injuries hampered him, and he may surely never return to what he once was, but if it is a resurgent season for him in New York, we're looking at over 20 fantasy points per game for the 3rd round. Now, my last 2 picks were the most questionable, but it's starting to become widely believed that Josh Giddy is going to be a breakout candidate and steal in this draft. As a contender, it's contradictory to go with a rookie whose game isn't established, but in the 4th round with not many great heavy hitters left, why not go with someone who has the chance to put up triple doubles and be a fantastic young asset? Giddy came from the same league LaMelo played in before the NBA, so he's already played against grown men and professional talent. There's reason to believe he has a very good rookie season. Still though, it's a risky pick because even if he does develop into a good NBA player, it's extremely possible that that doesn't happen this year, and I need guys that will help me contend. Either way, he could be an enticing trade piece for the future. Lastly, I selected Moses Brown in the follow-up draft. I think he would have been selected in the 2nd round if he was actually locked into the rotation, especially if he was getting starters minutes. So, I don't know. The fact of the matter is, he's not going to play at all. So it was probably a pretty dumb pick if we're being honest. However, if he does play, especially with all the injuries that go on in that Dallas front court, we're looking at scary good fantasy output. But that likely won't be the case, and I'll probably have to drop him. And in the end, at the time of me saying this, I already have dropped him. These were just some of my notes, but I fucking dropped him. But anyway, if basically anything could happen, but what separates me from Josh and James in these rankings is that I probably have the best track record in my decision making and trade negotiations. I have a Trader of the Year under my belt. I have a best draft. I have a GM of the Year, and I'm a 2-time All Fantasy contestant. James and Josh are MVPs that share 3 conference titles and a championship, and I'm prone to mistakes as well, like overpaying for players and gambling in the draft when it's not in my best interest, but I think my team is ready to take that next step and reach the finals this year. It's gonna be crazy! But we are not done with the predictions yet, folks. It's time to predict all of the awards as well. We may or may not add new awards at the end of the season, such as maybe like draft steal or something else if we think of something good, but for now, we're just going to stick with the ones we know. And starting it off, we'll go with the conference titles. I already did everyone's records in these rankings, so I'm not going to cover that here, but when it comes to the conferences, the West is easy because I can't imagine anyone actually challenging James for the West. It's his conference at this point, and until a worthy adversary steps up, you can't choose anyone else. The East is where things get a little trickier since we had 3 12-plus wins last year. 3 12-plus wins teams last year. And now you add a much improved Oof Magoo's into the mix, and that makes things pretty tough. But I'm going to go with myself because I think I'm going to squeak past Josh with one more win, just as he and Anthony did last year to me. But it will be a close race with Gio not far behind either. Moving over to most improved, Gio holds the mantle, but it'll be hard to improve twice back-to-back like that. He could, but he'd have to be one of the top 2 teams in the league for it to really happen. The most likely candidate is CJ because even if he wins just 2 games, that's an improvement over the season before. Other candidates include Cam, Gary, and Sam, but I have a hard time imagining CJ doesn't drastically enhance his play after an upgraded roster and solid offseason. Now, I discussed the draft a lot, so I don't want to repeat myself too much, but the way I see it right now is that Cam, James, and I had the best selections at this moment in time. Things always change when it comes to the draft, so you have to see how the year plays out, but I easily have to pick Cam to go back-to-back after getting Cade Cunningham, Jalen Green, and Evan Mobley with the first 3 top picks. And that's only half of his draft, too, as he snagged Mchale Alexander-Walker, Miles Bridges, and Wendell Carter Jr. Maybe some of these guys don't pan out, but they're still all young, and they fit Cam's rebuild and structure, and most of these guys will pan out, maybe even just this season, so it's hard not to go with him. Moving on to Trader of the Year, there's always so many options to choose from. What usually gets the people going, however, are the blockbuster trades where someone receives the better player. In this case, you can make the argument that CJ is in the lead right now for getting Karl Anthony Towns. On the flip side, Cam got Anthony Edwards and 2 top 3 picks out of it at the perfect time for his fresh start rebuild. It's arguable who won the trade as what direction they're going in helps their stances too, but there's so many more trades and transactions that have yet to go down, so it's too early to obviously accurately tell. You could choose either of these guys, you could go with Josh, you could go with Anthony, but right now I think I'm leading the way since I have 4 trades completed already where I clearly won each. Not saying others didn't also win, because there's, trades where both sides come out victorious, but in my case, I got a top 6 pick that I turned into top 5, another lottery pick, Nikola Vucevic, DeMar DeRozan, and Jonas Valanciunas, and the best draft pick I gave up was a 3rd rounder, while getting rid of the tumultuous headache of Kyrie Irving and the constantly hospitalized Kristaps Porzingis. For those reasons, and since the season literally hasn't even began yet, so I know I've got more in the back seat, I'm going to go with myself for my 2nd Trader of the Year. Now we get to the awards where I'm going to make some people mad at me. The All Dumbass Team. I apologize in advance, but at the end of the day, there's going to be 3 people on the All Dumbass Team at the end of the year, so we got to predict it. Out of the gate, it's impossible not to pick Sam again. Whether he ends up on it or not, there's no denying that at this moment in time, he's one of the front runners to make the team. I'll give him a pass on drafting too many players because the draft was hectic, but the fact that he dropped Jarrett Allen, Mchale Bridges, and would have done the same for Valanciunas without getting anything for them is pretty bad. We know he's not going to set his lineup and leave guys in his IR for half the season, so unless he finally proves us wrong, he's going back-to-back All Dumbass. Next up in their first appearance will be Gary. Gary will likely be the worst team in the league this season with an unclear vision and poor roster management. He could still escape an All Dumbass selection as CJ did last year, but that's not very likely due to some of the decisions he's already made. Some questionable trades and draft choices are some of the clear-cut reasons, but he also only selected 4 people in the draft. The draft was hectic this season, but you gotta at least realize you didn't have enough roster spots. Maybe Gary can prove us all wrong, but as we know with Ish, even playoff teams can still be All Dumbass. Lastly, it's a tough decision for the final roster spot between Cam and Anthony, but I'm going to have to choose Cam. I don't think Cam deserved all dumbass last year for adjusting to the course his team was taking, but the rest of the league seemed to disagree. Cam should be a bottom Cam should be a bottom 3 team once again, and I don't see why the league is going to change their minds. Even if he has the same exact year, I still won't think he's going to be deserving of all dumbass, but that means everyone else will. So it all depends how the season goes, but I believe the DBL will vote him back-to-back all dumbass. There's always other options like reigning all dumbass selection-ish and former all dumbass Anthony, but these are the 3 I believe that will make the team in 2022. So that means dumbass of the year has got to be one of these 3, and again, it's obviously Sam until proven otherwise. Sam literally just has to set his lineup every week, and he could potentially win the league, but until he consistently does so, he won't, which makes him the dumbass of the year with the team this good. Moving on to GM of the year, it usually aligns heavily with Trader of the Year and MVP, but you don't have to be all fantasy or a champion to be the GM of the year. Think of Sam Presti with the Thunder. They're an awful team but have an excellent GM that stockpiled future picks and assets. That's a reason Cam might deserve some love, but I don't think he'll win. So I'd say this year will be between me, CJ, and Josh. CJ is probably going to look to make some more trades and pay keen attention to the wire as he fights for a playoff spot. Josh is the reigning GM of the year with one of the best teams in the league, and I'm in a similar boat as Josh. But I think I'm going to go with a little bit of that dark horse pick and take CJ because of voter fatigue and because he'll likely continue to improve as a GM. It'll be a close one at the end of the voting totals for sure, though. That now brings us to all fantasy, and I think you have to consider me and Josh locks. That leaves us with a few other candidates, but namely James and Gio. I think James will be the king of the West once again and have the better overall record, so I think James will be selected to his second all-fantasy team instead of Gio alongside me and Josh. MVP? Well, again, it's really the same group of names. Josh, James, Joe, and Gio with dark horse chances of Ish, Sam, and CJ winning. You can make an argument for everyone. CJ wills his team to the playoffs as GM of the year. Ish surprises everyone and once again finishes nicely without making any moves all year. Sam shocks the world and actually pays attention and wins the DBL. Gio is a fresh new face stepping into the arena with the Titans this year, and James and Josh are previous winners who will continue to be dominant. But I'm going to pick me. If I finish with the best record, make excellent trades, and continue the streak of great regular seasons I've had, the voters will recognize me, especially when you factor in voter fatigue. It's anybody's game, but I predict I'll have my first MVP at next year's awards ceremony. And then that does it for the 2022 predictions. I can't wait to come back to this and see how on the money I was about some things and how dreadfully wrong I was about others. I still go back and watch both the previous season preview videos, and it's fun to see how different things have become and how close I was on some of my stances and projections. All I gotta say is this: good luck to everyone, and let's have another awesome year. Let's go Knights!